This is mini lecture 3 on false memory research. Now this is my area of research, so please do leave me questions and comments in the discussion board this week. Now I've been thinking about it, why am I fascinated with this? What is it about my views on this that I could pass on to students so they're fascinated too? The first thing is me understanding the case studies, right? So I was motivated by the case studies, very upset that people were falsely imprisoned. So that's part of it. And that's what I've been trying to build with you guys over the first 2 weeks. But it's also something very cerebral as well. Now, this is a kind of a strange idea, but I just want to pass it on to you. I'm just really fascinated in finding out how memory works, because in the first time in human history, in the last 100 years, we have discovered how memory works as best we can so far. So it's just amazing when you think about it. I mean, why wouldn't you want to learn science? Think about it for a second. When we evolved from slime, no other organism has been aware of itself like we are, and nobody has ever figured out how things work. And it's just a miracle that we've figured out how the world works. And it's amazing that we have figured out how our own neurons work. Our own neurons have figured out how neurons work. Anyway, so that's kind of a wacky way of thinking about it, but that's why I don't want to waste my time on Earth learning about Katy Perry. I want to learn about memory. I want to learn about figuring out how things work for the first time in human history, and we have just been born in the right time to be on that forefront, right? So for thousands and hundreds of thousands of years, we didn't know, we couldn't find out, we didn't know how to find out, and then we are born in the 100 years of which we started discovering things in psychology. So anyway, that's why I'm constantly curious, and that's why I'm an academic. And I've just thought that, framing it that way may help some of you kind of value learning these detailed things, like reading chapters, reading textbooks. You might kind of value that more than the entertaining stuff. And sometimes I also value the entertaining stuff too much. So I'm in the same boat too. Okay, having said that, let me just outline the way I think about false memory research, just very vaguely to start with. I think of it this way. There was some good research done in the 1800s, on word lists and so on. Then I think about it this way. Some early work was done by FREDERIC Bartlett in Cambridge in 1932, where he used a story and he showed that people remembered that story by constructing it according to their culture, right? So he came up with the idea that memory is constructed rather than recorded. So that was important. I think it was in the 1930s when science in medicine and psychology started to adopt randomly assigning people into groups too, so the scientific method in psychology was developed by statisticians. I think it was in the 1800s, and then it continued into the 1930s. I think there was an important book in the 1930s. But anyway, that translated to very good memory research being started in the 1960s, where they did use experimentation. And that's where we started to learn cause and effect. And then the next stage in false memory research specifically, I think of as being Elizabeth Loftus applying her cognitive research skills of being very careful at controlling for variables using random assignment, and using that to establish cause, in that misinformation causes false memories or causes memory distortions of details in that work, which was her work in 1974, Loftus and Palmer, and 1978, Loftus and colleagues, on the misinformation effect. Then we've had all sorts of developments in the misinformation effect since then, like finding out the timing of the delay between the scene and the misinformation, finding out how long you have to wait until the original memory fades before you give misinformation. A lot of development in theory that I talked about last time. And then in the 1990s, they started to explore rich false memories or entire false memories of entire events, such as the famous Lost in the Mall study, which I know is not perfect, but the research that followed it, picked up on some of the faults of the research. Is very hard research to do, by the way. And then again and again and again since the 1990s, we have had conceptual replications of the idea that you can implant entire memories in people given enough time, given enough repetition, in about 25% of participants in one experiment, right? So, and that has developed over time where we have been measuring personality variables, and we haven't really found strong personalities that are more susceptible to false memories. We have investigated people with superior memory. That's a study that I led. We found that they are also susceptible to memory distortions. And we've just got a lot of the details down now, which if you look at modern false memory research, you can get into. It's very, very interesting. So that's just a general overview of me explaining the research just as it is mapped out in my head. And let's take one of those ideas I just laid out, Frederic Bartlett's work in his book Remembering in 1932. This is really interesting to me because it just shows that while the Americans were just doing behavioral research, behaviorism, English people like Frederic Bartlett was still, investigating things like memory, which is very good. So one of his most famous studies is the War of the Ghost studies. And by the way, he did not use very good experimental techniques like Loftus would in the 1970s. But he's been as careful as he can in these studies. So he presented this story, the War of the Ghosts. One night, two young men from Igulac went down to the river to hunt seals, and while they were there, it became foggy and calm. And then I'll skip over some. And the warriors went up on the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently, the young men heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let's go home. The Indian has been hit." Now they thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. And then I'm going to skip a bit, and it ends this way. He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face was contorted. The people jumped up and cried. He was dead. Now, this was given as a source of information that you had to remember in his study. So if I were to ask you a few days later, what do you remember about this story? The point is you would reconstruct it according to your expectations and how you coded it. And indeed, he found with British participants at Cambridge, they tended to remember things slightly differently from what they had heard. They reconstructed it according to their schemas about how stories work and about how they expect things to be with cultural expectations. For example, the part about hunting for seals was misremembered quite often by British people as going fishing, right? Because we don't hunt for seals very often. So the cultural component really is not the point. The point that Frederic Bartlett found is that we tend to reconstruct things based on our knowledge and our expectations. So this is really a foundational idea that holds up today nicely. All the research in memory points to reconstruction. Even biological aspects of memory discoveries make us think about things being reconstructed. It kind of converges, the evidence. And this idea that memory is malleable, can be reconstructed, was shown to be true experimentally by people like Elizabeth Loftus in decades later. For example, in Elizabeth Loftus's research, Loftus and Palmer, she investigated the memory that people had of car accidents. She got a grant from the Department of Transportation to investigate how reliable people's memories are of car accidents, of course, because that could have legal consequences. Now, what she found was the memory that people had depended upon how you phrased a question. So she was starting to find out that if you had something suggestive in your questions, and this, of course, this applies to the law as well, you can induce people to remember things in a distorted way. In one question, she asked people, report the amount of broken glass you remember when the cars smashed into each other. And in another group, she said, how much broken glass was there when the cars hit each other, right? So smashed is suggestive of a big collision that might lead people to remember more broken glass, and hit is more neutral. And indeed, those in the smash condition did remember more broken glass, right? And also, in another seminal paper where she did a more pure example of what we consider to be a misinformation effect, also to do with traffic accidents, it's the very famous study with the stop sign and yield sign, where people were given suggestive questions with misinformation in them. For example, they were asked how many cars were they at the yield sign, but they actually had seen on the slideshow a stop sign, right? So this is how it worked. The participants would see a slideshow of a series of events involving a car and a pedestrian, and then a pedestrian would get injured or something like that. A period of time later, allowing that memory of the slideshow to fade, they would be asked questions such as, what do you remember at the yield sign? And then the yield sign is the misinformation. And then you'd ask them later, was the car stopped at a yield sign or a stop sign? And you would find that people who were told misinformation would falsely remember it being a yield sign instead of a stop sign. And the good part about both of these experiments we're talking about is random assignment into groups was done, right? So one group of participants was randomly assigned to get the misinformation, and another group was randomly assigned to not get misinformation. And of course, the false details remembered later was higher in the misinformation group. That, in fact, is the misinformation effect. A lot of research has been done since then that has improved upon it, used videos, used live viewings, and all sorts of things. Found the same thing. In fact, in 2010 and 11, when I did my first misinformation effect study, guess what? It replicated. It is really, if you do it properly, it's a really reliable finding. Now, there has been research also later on into false memories of entire events, which is much more difficult to do, but it is possible. It takes a lot of resources to do a single study like this. So the question is, can whole events be falsely remembered? This is important for the debate about repressed memories, isn't it? If you read Mark Pendergrass's first chapter, it makes it very important to establish this. Well, Loftus and Pickrell's 1995 Lost in the Mall study was one of the first to attempt this. You know, it was only a study with, I think, about 25 individuals, so you can criticize this a lot. But the point is, it's been replicated in the decades since that in different ways with different events. So she found about 24 or 25% of participants reported remembering being lost in the mall using a technique of you have to get information from their family to know that first being lost in the mall didn't happen, so they confirm that. And then you get 4 true items, and then you ask them about all 5 things. And then you kind of put the lost in the mall suggestion in there, and you falsely tell them that, oh yes, your family member told us that you were lost in the mall. Can you tell us more about that? And then they have another session where they develop the imagining even more, and then they build the memory even more, and eventually you embed a false memory. So other research, and this is probably more important than the seminal Lost in the Mall study, because it could have gone any way. It could have been possible that this did not replicate, but it does. It's not easy to do, but there's been other research by Porter and colleagues that found that so you can implant whole memories of a vicious animal attack. Hyman and colleagues in the 1990s also embedded spilling punch at a wedding, so a false memory spilling punch at a wedding that was confirmed not to have happened. And more recently, some participants came to believe that they had committed a crime that they didn't commit. At least that's what they self-reported. Some of them just believed it and didn't remember it. Some of them actually created a false memory, and that's in the Shaw paper there. So there's more than this research to talk about, and I encourage you to dig deep into it if you are not convinced by these examples here. Okay, let's have some fun with this one. I'm going to read you a list of words. Pay careful attention to each word and try to remember them as well as you can, and then I'll test you on the list, okay? Light, shade, table, bulb, post, black, cord, desk, bright, lighter, read, on, bed, burn, stand. Okay, that's the end of the list. Now I'm going to shortly test you. Do you remember hearing the word butterfly? Yes or no? Do you remember hearing the word moth? Yes or no? What about the word light? Did you hear the word flower? Did you hear the word desk? Did you hear the word lamp? Okay, did any of you say that you remembered the word lamp? Are you sure? Actually, the word lamp was not presented. This is a DRM word list, which is a list of words that are semantically related, and they all activate the same one critical lure that is not actually presented. The critical lure is the word that is related to all the words in the list, but it is not actually said in the list, right? Now, this research goes back to preliminary research by Deese in 1959, and it was reinvented by Roediger and McDermott in 1995. So that's why it's called DRM, their surnames. Now, the way you explain this is a combination of those theories that I told you about earlier. So spreading activation is when one concept in your mind activates other concepts nearby. And the closer the concept, the more it's activated, right? So you could think of, when I was reading that initial list, what I was doing is I was activating all of those words, but I was also activating the word lamp a little bit each time so that it was activated many times over the list. And the other theory that helps you explain this is source monitoring. So you feel that that idea of lamp has been activated, and you're not sure whether that was something you heard or something you didn't hear. So it's difficult attributing source to it. Because it's an easy type of false memory paradigm to use, it's been used hundreds of times in hundreds of different peer-reviewed papers. I used it myself, and I found something like a 70% endorsement rate of the false memory, of the false word that was not actually presented. So in this case, lamp. And that's a similar percentage to many other studies. So in other words, a very high percentage of the time, people remember hearing the word that they did not hear, including me, by the way. I fall for this. It's such a powerful effect. Now let's talk about another way to implant false memories, guided imagery or imagination inflation. So the background here is in hypnosis sometimes, and in other types of therapy, they use guided imagery to reimagine what possibly could have happened in order to try and recover a memory. And the point of this research is to show that could be dangerous in that it might create memory distortions. There are other kinds of guided imagery that are less problematic, of course, like guided imagery about quitting smoking. I'm not talking about that type of guided imagery. I'm talking about guided imagery to recall recovered memories. Now, it appeared that guided imagery was causing problems in psychotherapy, But to prove that it could possibly be the case, they investigated it in the lab here with Marianne Gary leading this study. In this study, they had one group imagining vividly, repeatedly childhood events, and over time, the confidence that those events happened went up over time. So it was like confidence inflation that this had happened. And the concern is, of course, is that the confidence that an event might have happened might be inflated in psychotherapy too. Unfairly, it might not be true. In other research, they have done it in the lab where they get people to perform a task in the lab physically, or to imagine doing a task in the lab. And then later on down the line, you ask them to recall what they imagined and what they actually did in the lab. And there's quite a lot of source monitoring errors where they misremember doing things in the lab when in fact they had only imagined it in the lab a few weeks earlier. That is Goff and Rodiger's paper in 1998. So guided imagery is an important thing to consider. These guided imagery errors are explained by source monitoring errors, right? So you have difficulty distinguishing between imaginings and what happened really because they are similarly encoded in the brain as a real memory. The memory of the tag of where it came from might fade over time. And indeed, there is some interesting research by Daniel Schachter at Harvard that shows that when you do brain scans of people imagining things, it looks similar to when you do brain scans of people remembering things. So there is quite a lot of converging evidence that imagining things and remembering things and experiencing things all excite similar areas of the brain, just slightly differently, but you can see why there might be confusion many years later or many weeks later. There's been research in hypnosis, which is, of course, guided imagery can be used in hypnosis, but there's been specific research looking at hypnosis where Jean-Roch Laurence and Perry got this paper published in Science, actually, where they used hypnotism to induce a false memory of waking up in the middle of the night last week and then hearing something specific. And then with repetition, they were able to implant this memory. And Mamelstein and Lin also have done research. They found that subjects reported earlier memories during hypnosis than they did both prior to hypnosis and prior to memory recovery instructions, right? So the hypnosis was fairly powerful in inducing earlier memories, which could possibly be distorted or inaccurate. Or now, if you want to learn more about infantile amnesia, you can read Mark Howells and Mary Courage's paper in 1993 in Psychological Bulletin. If you do apply the scientific method carefully, you can see in the literature that when you do measure it carefully, I think almost 100% of people have infantile amnesia. And the reason behind it is twofold. There's two different theories. One is that you develop, your brain matures in terms of neuron growth and in myelination, so that all the autobiographical memories that you start to form in early childhood kind of get grown out of your brain system. So maturation is the explanation. And the other explanation is the idea that you don't have a strong enough sense of self in early childhood that you need to form autobiographical memories, right? So think about autobiographical memories. They relate to the self. You need to actually be able to relate things to yourself before you can start to store autobiographical memories better. And there has been some more research, and I'll just pick out some of them because I think this is probably one of the most important areas of research since the seminal papers. We have discovered that there's probably no false memory trait found among healthy people, such as students and the public. The idea that there's no false memory trait was discovered in two different ways. First of all, we found that there's no personality trait that we found that correlated very highly with false memory susceptibility, right? So it's not the case that we found that women were more susceptible, or we found that people who are neurotic are more susceptible, or we found that People who were extroverts were more susceptible. No, we found 0 results in that area. And what we also found was if somebody were to fall prey to a false memory in one type of false memory study, if you study that same person and put them through a different type of false memory study, there was no correlation between susceptibility between the 2 different types of false memory. So in other words, those who had a lot of false memories on word lists did not have more false memories on the misinformation effect. Those that had more false memories for a news event did not have more false memories for word list, right? So there was no correlations between susceptibility. So the conclusion I came to here is that within healthy individuals, everybody is really susceptible to false memories. Now, we're not going to be susceptible to falling for false memory suggestions every time. Maybe once every 10 times we might fall for it, right? But over a lifetime, the suggestions that we hear might result in some memory distortions. And in my study here, which I did with a few different researchers at University of California, we found that even people with superior autobiographical memory, highly superior, were susceptible to memory reconstruction. So the way I think about this is I went out of my way to find those individuals who were most likely to be immune from memory distortions, right? They had really powerful memories. They were on 60 Minutes. They were so amazing, these people. The idea was that they could remember every day for decades past. I'm a little bit skeptical that they can remember every day, but that's what they think they can remember. And I found that they were susceptible to memory reconstruction. You know, for example, they had some false memories. Some of them had false memories on the word lists that I gave them. Some of them had false memories on the misinformation effect, and some had false memories about news events, right? So this is me being very Popperian, very much following Popper's idea of falsifiability. I really went out of my way to find disconfirming evidence that everybody's susceptible. I found the most likely group to disprove my idea that everybody's susceptible, and my idea survived. Indeed, I did find that they were susceptible to memory distortions. Now, I don't say it's easy to implant a false memory, but I think with enough repetition and enough motive, you know, for example, if you think that you will be cured if you remember your repressed memories, I think you can eventually come to create a false memory. I think we all can. And finally, let's pull together some conclusions. First of all, one of the first people to give us the idea that memory might be constructive or reconstructive out of our schemas was Bartlett, 1932. Then there was an experimental step forward with Elizabeth Loftus's work on the misinformation effect. And then you have some findings in hypnosis that have produced memory distortions. Of course, false memories in word lists is very easy to induce. False memories of entire events are also possible. I should also say that imagination inflation is another conclusion I haven't listed here. Imagination inflation can lead to increased confidence that something happened a long time ago. And there's been some research on the generalizability of susceptibility. In other words, is there a false memory trait? No, not really. We haven't been able to find one. And here are some of the references that I talked about this lecture. So I really hope you enjoyed it. Isn't it an amazing discovery? And believe it or not, we did not know this 30 years ago, and it's so helpful to society that we do know this. So spread the word, and thank you very much, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.